Hey there, welcome to this lesson. We're going to continue on the topic of reading data from files, but I'm going to show you a slightly better way of doing just that compared with the previous lesson. And this is actually an older technique used, previous to Java 7, Java 6, Java 5. This is an older way of reading data from files, but it's important to see how it works. Because it's going to give you the practice of how to use exception handling. And then in the next lesson, I'm going to show you an even more improved approach to reading and writing data from files, okay? So let's get started. I'm going to expand upon this processing files project and expand upon the source folder. And we created a package called com.imtiaz.exceptions. So this basically means that there's a com folder, C-O-M, and then in that we have an imtiaz folder. And then in that, we have an exceptions folder. So that's just to sort of organize our code better. I'm going to right click here and go to new and create a new package. And we can call it, com.imtiaz. I'll call it learning file reader. Okay. And then hit finish. And then in here, we're going to write the code for this lesson. Right click on this package and go to new class. I'm going to call it application class, and I want this class to be, able to run by right-clicking and just running. So we need the main method in here. So I'm going to select that option, and it's going to put the main method in this class. So inside of the main method is where we're going to do all the work. So let's first define a variable of type file, and I'm going to assign it an instance of file. So that file is going to be called, let's call it myfile.txt. And it's erroring right now because notice that this package is not imported yet, right? It says file cannot be resolved to a type, okay? This particular class, because we have to import it from the java.io package. So click on that, and then that will import the package that we need. And then it's still showing an exception. Hover your mouse here, and it's saying the method is undefined for the type application. And of course, what did I do here? Well, I need to use the new keyword. Okay, this was sort of a intentional bug just to remind you that don't forget the new keyword. All right, this variable is going to point to a new instance of a file class. Okay, and we're giving it the argument to the constructor of the file class. We're giving it the argument myfile.txt. So instead of using the scanner, we can use something called file reader. Let me show you how that works. I'll define another variable called file reader, and notice its data type. Its data type is going to be file reader, and in lowercase, I'm creating this variable file reader, and it's going to be used to point to a new file reader object. File reader, and to the argument of this, we're going to pass in the file that we created. Okay, so this file object is going to go into the constructor as an argument, okay, of this file reader class. Now, of course, this is not compiling because we have to import. Notice it says import file reader from java.io. So notice we did java.io.file, and then we have to do the same thing for file reader. So I can either press Control-Shift-O, and that will import this additional package. Or what I could do is I can actually just get rid of all of this up to file.io and then do .star. Okay, and that will import all of the required, all of the classes in this .io package. Okay, so hover your mouse over here and it's saying unhandled exception, file not found exception. Okay, so it's basically complaining that you need to do something in the case that there is an error, right? We're defining a file variable here, and we're passing it to this thing called file reader. And if the file reader is not able to, for whatever reason, find the particular file that we define up here, then we need to do something so that the user knows that, hey, there's an exception. And that's what it's basically asking us to do, is handle this exception. So I could do the throws declaration. If I click this, it's going to add that exception to this main method, and this is basically going to throw the exception to the end user that's using our program. They're gonna see this scary, hairy looking, stack trace, and that's typically not a good way of doing it. You want to, not do that. So I just wanted to show you that that's possible. Instead of doing that, the better way is use try catch, and I showed you in the previous lesson the try catch block. So I'm going to click on surround with try catch. And now this line of code, if there's ever an issue with this line of code, it's going to jump into the catch block. And what is the catch portion going to do? Well, it's just going to print to the screen the trace of the error, the print stack trace. So we can make this an even more gentle handling by just printing to the screen and say file not found. Right, so I defined a file reader, and you can click on this, control click the file reader, and it'll take you to that class. And notice it takes the file object. It takes a file object as an argument to this constructor. Okay, so of course we need to have a file object instantiated already, and that's what this guy is. Right, we're instantiating an instance of file, and we're passing it to the constructor of file reader. So now this file reader has the ability to be able to read files. Another thing we need to do is use something called a buffered reader. Buffered reader. And this is another class that I'll introduce you in a little bit. But basically we create a variable of type buffered reader. I'm going to just call it buffered reader. And then we give the class again buffered reader. And to the argument of buffered reader, we need to give this file reader object, which is right here. So we pass that into the argument of the constructor buffered reader. And notice that this time we didn't have to import, because guess what? We are importing everything in the java.io package. Right? That's why it's able to quickly recognize this, because we are importing all of the classes in the java.io package. If I didn't have this .star, right? If I just did java.io for example, file, then notice that this is going to complain. Hover your mouse, it says import file reader. I have to click that, import that, and then over here it's saying import buffered reader. I have to import that. So let's import it. And then of course this thing, file not found exception, that also needs to be imported. So all of these things are in the file.io package. So I'll leave it here for now. I just wanted to show you that you can use the .io star asterisk to indicate that we want basically all of the files in this package. But it's good to see the classes that you're using in the import, so that you can understand where the code that you're using here is coming from. So now we have a buffered reader object, and the reason this is there is it buffers the characters into lines. For example, this file reader is able to read everything in characters, and there's no real easy way of reading the data using the file reader directly. We need to use this thing called buffered reader, and this class has the ability to take a file reader object and go line by line reading the data. And it's actually more efficient. It doesn't read the entire file in one go. It reads it line by line. So to be able to read the data, I can define a variable of type string, and I'll call it line, and I'm going to assign it the buffered reader dot read line. Whatever this method returns, that's going to be assigned to this line, and it's of course going to read the line and assign that to this string variable called line. Now this is going to complain. Hover your mouse here, and it's saying unhandled exception type IO exception. So we've already seen the file not found exception. It'll enter this block of code if for whatever reason it's unable to find the file, if it's misnamed or if it's been deleted or whatever is the reason. It's going to come here if it can't find the file. It needs to also handle an exception in the case that there is a problem during the reading or writing to the disk, and that's what this IO exception means. We can either add throws declaration or surround it with another try and catch block. And another thing we could do, which I recommend at this point, is add a catch clause to surrounding try. Okay, so click on this and notice, boom, it added another catch block. Let me just get rid of that line there. So if this line does not execute properly, if there's an error, then it's going to jump into this catch block, not this one. It's not going to go here. It's going to go to this catch block. And the reason for that is this method throws a IO exception. Right? It doesn't throw a file not found exception. It throws an IO exception. And I'll prove it to you. Control click this method. It says throws IO exception. Okay? And if you hover your mouse here on this, this is the actual class. It belongs in java.io IO exception. It says signals that an IO exception of some sort has occurred. And basically what this means is if there is a problem with your disk accessing, reading, or writing data from the disk of your computer, that's when this exception will be triggered. So we need to make sure that we capture it and do something useful with that error if it occurs. And right now it's just by default does print stack trace. But instead of printing gibberish to the screen, I could just have it print something a bit more reader friendly. And we could say problem reading the file. And I'll also append to the end of that sentence the file name. So I could do file dot, let's see if this object, this file object contains a get name method. And of course it does. Okay. Notice that this method is saying returns the name of the file or directory denoted, and it's going to basically print out myfile.txt. So if we run into an IO exception, if there's some input output to the disk, if there's an error during that process, it's going to print this to the screen. The next thing we could do is have a while loop. So while the line is not equal to null, we're going to continue to do something. And I can just print out whatever line, whatever data gets assigned to line. I'm going to just print that out. And then we, of course, need to advance this line to the next line in the file. And we could just do this again. I'm just going to copy this and paste it right here. All right. So it's going to read the next line and assign it to line until it's done reading all of the lines in the file. And then once that happens, line will be assigned to the value of null, and that's when it'll be able to break out of the while loop. So we also need a way to close this buffered reader. So we could do that in a block called finally. Right? And this is, we haven't seen this yet. The finally block happens no matter what happens. Okay, this finally block will always run as long as this application is running, it's executing code. This finally block will always run. So if there's an exception during this try block, it's going to run into one of these exceptions, but then it's also going to get into the finally block. If there are no exceptions, if everything in the try block runs successfully, it's still going to go to this finally block and execute whatever code is there. And typically this is the area where we can close the resources that are being used. So this buffered reader is a resource that's being used to read data from this file. So I could do bufferedreader.close, and it's going to give us an error at this point because hover your mouse here and it's saying buffered reader cannot be resolved. So it doesn't know in the finally block, it doesn't know what buffered reader is. Of course, the reason for that is because buffered reader is it's a variable right here that's been defined in the try block. So inside of these brackets, whatever's been defined, you can't access that stuff outside of those brackets. Inside of these brackets, we're defining these variables. They're not going to be accessible outside. So what we should do is define this buffered reader variable. What we should do is we should define this buffered reader variable outside of the try block. And for starters, I'm just going to assign it the value of null. And in here, when we are assigning a new object of file reader, buffered file reader, we're going to, we won't need to redefine this variable. It's already been defined up here. So we could just assign a new instance of buffered reader to this already existing variable of type buffered reader. All right. And now we should have access to close this guy. Hover your mouse here and it's saying an IO exception. The error now is showing us something different. Before it wasn't even able to figure out what this variable meant. Now it's saying that, hey, what will I do if there is an exception during closing of the file. Okay, hover your mouse over here, click on the close method. In the buffered reader class, this close method, notice it also throws an IO exception. All right, so what we could do is surround this with a try catch. So for whatever reason, if there is a case that it has trouble closing the buffered reader, we want to catch that exception. And I'm just going to print out here and say unable to close file. And I'm going to append the file name here, file.getName. So this is sort of a roundabout, hairy way of reading files. It's not as pleasing to look at. You have a lot of try and catches. A lot of things can go on when you read files from your computer, and you need to make sure you have these try and catch blocks. In the next lesson, I'll show you a more modern way of doing the same thing using Java 7 features. But it's important for you to see how this works, because there's a lot of code out there in the industry that's been written using this kind of structure. So let me just expand the console here. If I hit play, notice it says file not found, and then it gives the exception. And this is actually a different kind of exception, but we'll get to that in a second. It says file not found. That means this portion was run, right? And this is the file not found exception. And that can happen if we have a misnamed file or the file just doesn't exist. And of course, myfile.txt does not exist yet. Okay, I have my file changed, but I don't have myfile.txt. So let me just copy this, and I'm going to paste it in the same place, and I'm going to rename it to myfile.txt. All right, and now you shouldn't see that this file not found problem. So let's hit play, and notice that it printed everything that was in this myfile.txt. If you click on this, notice it does have that data. Now going back to that exception for a second, I'm gonna rename this to myfile_wrong, and now hit play, and notice it's giving us the file not found exception, which we expect, but it's giving us this other thing. It's saying null pointer exception, and notice that it gives the line number of where it's seeing this. It's telling us in the com.imtiaz.learning file reader package, in the application class, in the main method, there is a line at number 33, which is right here. At this line, it's throwing an exception, and that is the null pointer exception. So the reason for that is because if we have a wrongly named file, for example, we called it myfile_wrong, it does not exist in our computer, then of course the buffered reader is not going to be able to open the file with this name. But that's not really the core problem here. This null pointer exception is happening because on line 17 it crashed. The program crashed at line 17. The file reader tried to read a file that doesn't exist, and so it never actually moved on to line 18, where the buffered reader was supposed to be assigned an object, right? The buffered reader variable on line 14 is just, it's null. We haven't given it an object yet. That object is assigned on line 18, and so since line 18 never ran, buffered reader was null, and you can't execute methods on null variables. All right, so we should also catch the situation where a wrong file name was given, and we don't want our users to see this hairy looking exception, right? This is not very pleasing to look at, and it doesn't really tell us anything. Null pointer exception. One approach would be to catch the null pointer exception. So we would do it like this. This is the variable that represents null pointer exception, and I could just print to the screen and say file was probably never opened. And I can choose to append. I could choose to append this variable, which will, contain this nasty looking exception here as part of this friendly looking sentence that I put here, just to give more details as to what happened. Now this is probably the worst, the worst usage of null pointer exception. Typically, you should not be catching null pointer exceptions. I just wanted to demonstrate to you what the code would look like if we were to catch a null pointer exception. But typically, the programmer is expected to know what data may be null. We're specifically stating in the beginning of this code that buffered reader and file reader are assigned the value null. So, chances are if there's an error, the buffered reader and the file reader may not be assigned anything, so they'd be left as null. So this is sort of an expectation. This could happen, and that's catching an exception that can clearly be avoided in the actual code. Exceptions are, as their name implies, to be used only for exceptional conditions. They should never be used for ordinary control flow. So here, this is a ordinary control flow situation. We know we can possibly get a null pointer exception, so we're catching that. I'm going to show you a better way, a more obvious way to handle null pointers in the next lecture, but I want you to ponder upon this and see this code. If you see it somewhere, get rid of it and try to get to the root of what could actually be causing this null pointer exception, okay, and fix that problem first. You shouldn't be using this null pointer exception, but I wanted to make sure you see this code and ponder upon this before you start the next lecture, in which I'll explain to you a better approach in handling this.